Night my husband told me he was stuck in a meeting. I was sitting in our favorite restaurant on Wellington Street, watching him kiss my daughter-in-law across the room. I had arrived early, that was the thing. I had arrived 20 minutes early because I wanted to be seated before him, wanted him to walk in and find me already there with the candle lit and the wine breathing, the way I used to do when we were young, and I still believed in small gestures. 40 years. That was what we were celebrating. 40 years of marriage, and I had taken the GO train from Oakville into the city because I wanted it to feel like an occasion rather than a Tuesday. The hostess had seated me near the back, a corner table I didn't ask for but didn't mind. The room was warm. It was November in Toronto, and outside the windows the street looked like it always does in November, grey and wet and lit orange under the street lamps. Inside there were white tablecloths and the low sound of other people's conversations, and I sat with my hands in my lap feeling, I'll admit, something close to happy. My phone buzzed at 7:14. "Running late, sweetheart. Client dinner ran over. Don't wait on the bread. I'll be there by 8. I read it twice. I set the phone face down on the table. I ordered a glass of Niagara Pinot Gris and looked at the menu I already knew by heart, and I thought, well, he works hard. He's always worked hard. That was the story I had been telling myself for 4 decades, and I was very good at it by then. I didn't notice him come in. That was what I kept returning to later. I didn't notice. I was looking at the menu. I was thinking about whether to order the salmon or the duck. And then something made me look up, some shift in the room, the way a room shifts when someone walks into it with certainty. And there he was. He was not at the door. He was already inside, already moving toward a table on the far side of the room, and he was not looking at me because he did not know I was there. He thought I was at home in Oakville, presumably, waiting. Or perhaps he had simply stopped imagining where I was at all. I have wondered about that since. He was wearing his grey wool coat, the one I bought him for Christmas 3 years ago. He sat down across from a woman I recognized. It took me a moment. That is the honest truth of it. It took me a full, terrible moment before my brain caught up with my eyes, because you do not expect to see your daughter-in-law in a restaurant where you are sitting alone on your wedding anniversary. You do not expect her to reach across a white tablecloth and cover your husband's hand with hers like she is returning something she borrowed. Her name is Petra. She married my son Marcus, 6 years ago in a vineyard outside Niagara-on-the-Lake, and I wore a pale blue dress and danced badly and cried when they said their vows and meant it completely. I had liked her. I want to be clear about that because it matters. I had genuinely liked her. I did not move. A waiter came by and said something I didn't hear. I must have nodded because he went away again. The room kept doing what it was doing. Plates arriving at tables, conversations rising and falling, candles throwing shadows across white linen, and I sat completely still in the corner and watched my husband lean forward and say something to my daughter-in-law that made her smile. Not a polite smile, the other kind. I want to tell you I felt rage. That would be simpler. But what I felt first was something more like the floor tilting, like the precise and quiet rearrangement of every room I had ever stood in. I kept thinking, how long? Not why. Not yet. Just how long, the way you press on a bruise to find its edges. My husband glanced around the restaurant once. His eyes passed over my corner without stopping. The light was low and I was in the back, and I was, I suppose, simply the last person he expected to see. I paid for my wine. I got up quietly, walked to the coat check, collected my coat, and went out into the cold on Wellington Street and stood there for a moment with my phone in my hand. I did not call Marcus. I know that might surprise you, but I had spent 40 years learning to think before I spoke, and I was not going to undo that on a November sidewalk outside a restaurant because my hands were shaking. I called a taxi. I went home to Oakville. I sat in the kitchen with the lights off, and I thought very carefully about what I had just seen and what it might mean and what I was going to do about it. My husband came home at 11:15. He smelled of the wine they serve at that restaurant, and he kissed me on the cheek and said the client dinner had run long. Sorry, sweetheart. He knew I had been looking forward to it. They would reschedule. I said that was fine. I asked if he was hungry. He said no. We went to bed. I lay in the dark beside him for a long time. I am 63 years old. I worked for 22 years as an administrator at a secondary school in Oakville before I retired. I raised 2 children, Marcus and our daughter Lee, who lives in Vancouver now. I have a pension, a modest one, and my name is on the mortgage of this house, and I have never once in 40 years given my husband a reason to doubt me. These are the things I was thinking about in the dark. The next morning, I drove to the Canadian Tire on Spears Road and bought a small voice-activated recorder, the kind that looks like a USB drive. I don't know why I went there instead of ordering something online. I think I needed to be doing something with my hands. I also called my friend Colette, who had divorced her husband 12 years ago after discovering he had been hiding money in a separate account for 3 years. Colette knew things I didn't. She gave me the name of a family lawyer on Lakeshore Boulevard, a woman named Hartley, and she told me to write down everything I remembered, date and time, and exactly what I saw, and not to confront anyone until I had spoken to Hartley. I wrote it all down that afternoon. I was very precise about it. Date, November 14th. Time, approximately 7:20 p.m. Location, the restaurant on Wellington. What I observed, my husband seated at a table with my daughter-in-law. Physical contact, she placed her hand over his. Duration of my observation, approximately 11 minutes. His expression, relaxed, familiar. The expression of a man who had been somewhere many times before. I met with the lawyer the following Thursday. Hartley was direct, which I appreciated. She explained my rights under Ontario family law, which, as she put it, were considerable. We had been married 40 years. I had supported his career, raised our children, maintained the household while he built the business. His business, a mid-sized commercial property management company with 4 employees and a portfolio of office and retail spaces across the GTA, was a marital asset, full stop. The house was a marital asset. The RRSPs were marital assets. She told me not to move any money, not to change any accounts, not to do anything that would look like I was planning to leave. She told me to document everything I could, carefully and without letting him know. I nodded. I took notes. I drove home and made chicken and rice for dinner and watched the news and went to bed beside my husband, who fell asleep in 11 minutes because he always has. I lay awake and thought about Petra. Here is what I could not understand. Marcus adored her. He had adored her from the very beginning, in the way that second children sometimes love, openly, without reservation, as though he had never learned to be careful with it. He called her every day when he was traveling for work. He had turned down a promotion in Calgary because it would have meant relocating, and she had built her dental practice here, and he had said without hesitation, "No, we're staying." That was the kind of man my son was. And his father had looked at that, had watched all of it, and had chosen this anyway. I started paying attention to the phone bill. We still had a shared account, an old TELUS family plan we'd never gotten around to separating, and when I pulled up the itemized records online, what I found made me sit very still in my kitchen chair for quite a long time. There were calls to Petra's number. Not occasional calls. Regular calls, sometimes twice in a day, sometimes late in the evening when Marcus would have been traveling. The earliest one in the records was 14 months ago. I printed the records. 62 pages. I put them in a green file folder from Staples, and I put the folder in the locked drawer of my desk in the room I use for sewing, the room my husband almost never enters. In December, Petra came to Christmas dinner. I want you to understand how strange that was. She sat at my kitchen table and ate the turkey I had roasted and the Brussels sprouts she always said she loved, and she handed me a candle set from Williams-Sonoma wrapped in craft paper and a bow, and she said, "Dot, this looks incredible. You always make it look so easy," and I smiled and said, "Oh, you know me. I just follow the same recipe every year." My husband carved the turkey. His hand did not shake. He laughed at my son's jokes. He asked Petra about her practice, how the new hygienist was working out. Marcus sat at the head of the table. My husband had given him the head, a small thing, a kind thing, the kind of father gesture that made my son look pleased and slightly embarrassed. And he reached over and put his hand over Petra's, and she turned and smiled at him. I watched my husband's face when she did that. He looked at his plate. I excused myself to check on dessert and stood in the kitchen with my hand on the counter for a moment, and then I took the pie out of the oven and brought it to the table because there was nothing else to do. In January, I hired an investigator. I know that sounds dramatic. It cost me $1,200 of my own money from a savings account I had kept separately for years, not out of suspicion, just habit, the way women of my generation sometimes quietly maintain a small measure of independence. Colette had suggested the investigator. She had used one herself. The investigator, a quiet man named Arsenault, gave me his report 3 weeks later. Photographs, dates, hotel receipts, the Marriott on Front Street twice, a parking garage on Bay, a coffee at the market on Saturday mornings when my husband told me he was at the driving range. I looked at the photographs for a long time. Then I put them in the green folder with the phone records, and I called Hartley and told her I was ready. The thing that most people don't understand, the thing I didn't understand until I was standing inside it, is that leaving a 40-year marriage is not a single moment. It is a series of very quiet decisions made over weeks and months, each one small, each one final. You decide to call the lawyer. You decide to open your own checking account at a different bank. You decide to find out the exact value of the business, the RSPs, the house, the rental income from the Muskoka property your husband has never once mentioned to your joint accountant because he reported it under a numbered company you didn't know existed. That last one I discovered in February, quite by accident, while I was going through a filing cabinet looking for the car insurance papers. A folder labeled with a 7-digit number. Inside, lease agreements, a property in Collingwood, monthly rental income of $2,200, 3 years of it. I photographed every page. I added them to the green folder. I called Hartley the same afternoon. She was quiet for a moment when I told her. Then she said, "Dorothy, I think we need to update our strategy." I was not going to tell Marcus. That was the decision I had made early and held on to. Not until I was ready, not until the paperwork was in order, not until there was nothing left for anyone to contest or hide. He was my son. I knew what disinformation would do to him, and I was not going to hand it to him while I was still fragile, while the ground under my feet was still uncertain. But in March, something changed. Petra called me on a Wednesday morning. She called me. My daughter-in-law, who had been meeting my husband in hotels on Front Street, called my phone at 9 in the morning while I was drinking coffee in my kitchen, and she said, "Dot, I need to talk to you. I think we should meet." I sat very still. I said, "Of course. When?" She said she could come to Oakville on Friday. I said Friday was fine. I hung up and I called Hartley and I called Colette and I sat in the kitchen for a while and then I called Marcus. I know. I said I wasn't going to, but I had heard something in Petra's voice, not guilt, not quite, something more like calculation, and I had been married 40 years to a man who spoke in that same register, and I recognized it, and I thought, my son needs to know before Friday. I drove to his house in Burlington that same afternoon. He was working from home. I sat at his kitchen table, the same way I sit at every kitchen table, and I told him what I had seen in November. I told him about the phone records. I told him about the investigator's report. I put 3 photographs on the table, face down first, and then face up. He didn't say anything for a long time. He is 36 years old, my son. He looked in that moment very young. Then he said, "How long have you known?" I said, "Since November." He said, "Why didn't you tell me?" I said, "Because I needed to make sure you were protected first, both of us." He looked at the photographs again. Then he pushed them away, not violently, just to the edge of the table, out of his immediate field of vision. He put his head in his hands. I put my hand on his back, and I didn't say anything because there are no words that help with this, and I knew that better than most. We sat like that for a while. On Friday, Petra arrived at my house at 10 o'clock. As she was dressed carefully, that was the first thing I noticed. She had dressed for a difficult conversation. She came in and sat at my kitchen table and accepted the tea I offered because she didn't know what else to do, and I sat across from her and waited. She said she was sorry. She said it had been a mistake, that it had started, she stopped and started again, that she had never meant for any of it to happen, that she had told him it had to stop, that she thought I deserved to hear the truth from her directly. I looked at her for a moment. Then I told her that Marcus knew. The color left her face completely. I told her that I had spoken to a lawyer, that Marcus had spoken to a lawyer, and that the process for both our situations was already underway. I told her that the TELUS records had been preserved, that I had a signed investigator's report, and that if there was any difficulty in the division of assets, I was fully prepared to pursue the matter in court and to let the documentation speak for itself. I was very calm when I said this. I surprised myself with how calm I was. She left 20 minutes later. She had not touched her tea. My husband came home that evening to find a letter from Hartley's office on the kitchen counter. He picked it up and read it, and then he stood in the kitchen for a long time without speaking. He tried eventually to tell me that it wasn't what I thought, that I hadn't understood what I'd seen, that Petra had come to him, that he had been trying to end it. I let him finish. Then I said, "The Collingwood property, the numbered company, I know about those too." He sat down. "I want to be honest with you about what that moment felt like. It did not feel like triumph. It felt like setting down something I had been carrying for a very long time, something so heavy and so familiar that I had stopped noticing the weight of it. It felt like an exhale after holding your breath for months." The divorce was settled out of court in the end. That is common in Ontario, and Hartley had prepared thoroughly. The business was valued at $1.4 million by an independent assessor. The Collingwood property was included in the asset calculation once it was formally disclosed. The marital home we agreed to sell, I used my portion of the proceeds to buy a small house in Port Credit, close enough to Marcus to be present without being in the way, far enough from everything else to feel like my own life. Marcus and Petra separated in April. She moved back to her family in Kitchener. I do not know, and have not asked, what exactly passed between them in private. That is not my story to tell. My son is quiet these days, not broken, just quiet, in the way of someone who has learned something they cannot unlearn and is deciding slowly how to carry it. He comes for dinner on Sundays. He sits in my kitchen in Port Credit, and we talk about ordinary things, his work, the news, what he is reading, and sometimes we don't talk about anything in particular, and that is fine too. I am 63 years old and I live alone for the first time in my life, and it is different from what I expected. It is harder in some ways, and in some ways it is something I don't quite have a word for yet. Easier is not the right word for yet. Easier is not the right word. Cleaner, maybe. Quieter. Mine. There is a bakery 2 blocks from my house, and I go there on Saturday mornings, and I sit by the window with a coffee and the newspaper, and nobody needs anything from me for at least an hour, and I find that I am increasingly not unhappy. That is not a small thing. I have decided to treat it as the large thing that it is. I keep thinking about the moment I sat in my kitchen in Oakville with the lights off, the night of November 14th, and made the decision not to pick up the phone and scream. That decision, quiet, deliberate, made in the dark, was the one that changed everything that followed. Not the confrontation, not the lawyer's office, not the photograph I slid across Marcus's kitchen table, face down and then face up. It was that first moment, alone, when I chose to think instead of react. I'm not saying I was strong in any heroic sense. I was terrified. I was 63 years old and the floor had just dropped out from under 40 years of my life. But somewhere in that fear was something steadier. A voice that said, "You need to understand what you're actually dealing with before you do anything at all." And I listened to it. That is the only thing I did right in those first hours, and it turned out to be the only thing that mattered. People sometimes ask, or they would if this were the kind of story you told at dinner, why I didn't confront him in the restaurant, why I didn't call Marcus that same night, why I waited 4 months. And the honest answer is that I had watched over 40 years what happens when people act from pure feeling without preparation. I had watched it in my own marriage, in other people's marriages, in the quiet devastation of friends who said exactly what they felt in exactly the wrong moment and lost everything they were trying to protect because of it. What my husband and Petra did was wrong. I don't need to complicate that or soften it. They made choices, repeatedly over at least 14 months, based on the phone records that treated 2 people who loved them as though they simply didn't exist. That kind of harm has a way of returning to its source, not because the universe is keeping score, but because the same carelessness that allows a person to deceive the people closest to them tends to show up in every other corner of their life too. The hidden property in Collingwood, the numbered company, these were not separate failures. They were the same failure expressed in different forms. And Marcus, I think about my son a great deal. He is quieter now, yes. There is something in him that wasn't there before, a wariness, a careful space he keeps around himself. And I would be lying if I said that didn't grieve me. But I also watch him making decisions now with the kind of clear-eyed steadiness he didn't always have, and I think that is not nothing. He came to understand something about paying attention, about not mistaking ease for safety, about the difference between trusting someone and simply never questioning them. That knowledge cost him enormously. I hope, in time, it also serves him. As for me, I live in Port Credit now. Small house, good light, 2 blocks from a bakery. I have my pension, my name on a mortgage that belongs only to me, and Saturday mornings that are entirely my own. I rebuilt what I needed to rebuild slowly and with help, Colette and Hartley, and eventually Marcus on Sunday evenings. The people who showed up. I think the most honest thing I can tell you is this. The outcome was not the result of luck or righteous anger. It was the result of paying attention, thinking clearly under pressure, and refusing to move until I understood the full shape of what I was dealing with. Not because I am exceptional, I am not, but because I had learned, somewhere in 63 years of living, that the clearest head in the room is almost always the most protected one. I go to the bakery on Saturday mornings and I sit by the window and the hour is mine, and I find I am not unhappy. I have decided that is worth saying out loud.